In an unusual and quite telling break from protocol, the G20's official youth engagement group, the Y20 Summit, concluded last week without issuing a final communiqué. The delegates, representing the world's next generation of leaders, failed to reach consensus on the summit's key outcomes document. This breakdown is widely attributed to deep divisions over the ongoing conflict in Gaza, highlighting how global geopolitical fissures are directly impacting even forums designed for future-oriented cooperation. Let's talk more about this now with Y20 Chairperson Raymond Matlala. A very good afternoon to you, Mr. Matlala. Thanks very much for your time. Give us a bit of background, if you will, to how you got to that stalemate.
Thank you so much, Vuyo, and good afternoon to yourself and the viewers at home. Look, it has been a challenging year for us. As you may know and be aware of the geopolitics, the current geopolitics that we are facing in the current climate. The issue of the communiqué really has been something that we've been, debating since May. So delegates had what we call them track delegates, who are official spokespersons of each of the 5 tracks which we have. We're given a task to come up with policy recommendations on those 5 tracks, AI, education, inclusive economic development, climate change, employment, multilateralism, and radical social inclusive development. Now, the issue of contention here is the Y20 South Africa presidency has indicated that we cannot always have a talk show. So Y20 is the oldest engagement group, which this year Y20 celebrates 15 years of existence, followed by your B20 with 10 years and W20 and so forth. However, Y20 has produced to date 14 communiques which have reached consensus, but none of those have explicitly find expression in the leaders' declarations. So that is our point 1. And our point 2 is, out of those 14 communiques, there is at least 350 policy recommendations, which today, as we sit here, none of them have been implemented. So as a result, Y20 engagement group has, been regarded as a talk show, and that is according to us as the presidents of South Africa for Y20. So what we then said was the proposal of a institutional mechanism in the form of a Y20 Council, which will look at 3 fundamental issues which we have been communicating with member states. So, and that would be continuity. That would be the implementation of the policy recommendations. And lastly, it will be an annual report, which will then track the implementation of those. So every year, the chairship will then come in and report. For example, this year we end, and next year the US take over the chairship. When we go to US, we must report on what have we achieved in the last communique. However, the G7 members, in particular, supported by 2 of the Global South countries, which is Turkey and Saudi, has, thoroughly undermined that proposal, and reducing it to just a vote than to even have a dialogue about it.
But I mean, was or is the issue of institutionalizing youth participation the only way of guaranteeing better outcomes? In other words, is it the only way of avoiding or of ensuring that you avoid your structure and subsequent conversations being a talk shop or place where you only talk about things and never really get to implement them?
Yeah, look, at this point, that is the only way we see it. And we look at this, we use other multilateral platforms, such as BRICS, such as your UN, such as your Commonwealth Youth Council. So we use those mechanisms And we also used in the engagement groups such as your C20 International Advisory Council, and something that B20 is also proposing this year is a similar mechanism. So for us, that is the only way we see it, because at the moment there is an existence of a group called the organizing committees. However, there is no accountability, and it's not a well-recognized structure globally by the G20 member states. It is recognized based on different country mechanisms and modalities. And what we're saying is that we need to have a well-composite, which is endorsed by heads of states, that has got the accountability mechanism and, of course, the powers or the responsibility of implementing those recommendations to move away from just being a talk show for 14 and 15 years this year.
Now, I mean, considering the fact that, I mean, I'm looking at the countries you said have opposed your proposition. Among them is it's the US, the UK, and the European Union, as you say, backed by Turkey and Saudi Arabia. But considering the fact that the US opposes, I should say, even the themes that South Africa has chosen during its presidency. Add to that the fact that the very first ministers' meeting, which was the foreign ministers' meeting in Nasrec, was actually boycotted by the United States of America, considering the fact that Donald Trump, to whom South Africa is supposed to hand over, is most likely will most likely not attend as things stand. Could you not have perhaps tread a little carefully in the interest of the bigger picture and the broader outcome that the G20 and not just your part, you know, of the G20 stands a better chance of succeeding?
Yeah, and maybe that's something that we need to clarify. You know, not having a communiqué is not a failure. Having a meaningless communiqué to us, that was going to be a failure. So I think that we needed to clarify. And I mean, you're quite correct. The US has been quite hostile in the G20 presidency holistically. Even on the Y20, the head of delegation of the United States of America was very hostile to our presidency. And we've had to, you know, put our foot down that we are not going to be allowed to be bullied by the global north. As a result, we took a very decisive decision that we're not going to have a communiqué at all cost. And either way, having this outcome communiqué, which is not implemented, which is a talk show, means nothing than to then resolve to have what we call the chair summary, which will then highlight some of the consensus and convergence that have came across the track negotiations by track delegates, and then also highlight the South Africa's high-level priorities, including the institutionalization and mechanism, and in particular youth mainstream within the G20, with also the establishment of the ministerial working group, because you've got these ministerial working groups that exist across the G20 working groups under the Sherpa trend. However, you don't have the one that deals with youth in particular, and those are the two kind of platforms that we have been championing for during our presidency, and that's something that we're going to champion through the G20 Social Summit, as you may be aware, that will take place in November.
Just as a parting shot, is it not inherent, though, in just how the whole G20 thing is run, that you will never really get to the core of issues and get people to agree? And some of the reasons people put forward for not agreeing, you know, at the end of it are quite, I mean, it's really feeble excuses, things that are neither here nor there. And this is what actually happened in Rio at the last G20 Summit. The excuse or the reason we couldn't get to a declaration was precisely because someone raised some really petty, if you ask me, issues. And there was a problem.
Yeah, look, I mean, for example, on the council, right? The issue is that the council is not. It's not like the council is not a good idea. It's not going to achieve its mandate, but it's just the fact that this group of 25 people that sits in the G20 wanted guarantees from myself, and I've got it on WhatsApp where France says to me, "We will give you this council if you give guarantees to OCs that they will be in charge of the council." However, I can't give guarantees. I can't go to the US, to China, to Brazil, and tell them, "This is Raymond. You must put them as in charge of the council." So those are the petty reasons that really exist as there. And I know even in Rio, for example, Brazil had to use sufficient consensus. So not all member countries agreed actually in all the factors. So they didn't have full consensus, but
yes,
at least Brazil was able to apply sufficient consensus to come up with the leaders' declaration. Maybe last point, just to say, the G7 itself this year at their summit in Canada in June, they did not reach a consensus. What they did was to come with a pocket of joint statements on areas where there's convergence. So it's not a new thing that is happening, especially during this geopolitics and the unrest, or rather the tensions that exist. And now with United States and South Africa as the chair, as everyone might be aware.
Raymond Matlala, let me thank you very much for your time. He is, of course, the chairperson of the Y20.